Around the year 750 before Christ, a provincial governor on the Euphrates recorded a complaint in stone. His name was Ninurta Kuduri Usur. He governed a small province called Suhu on the edge of the Assyrian Empire in what is now Iraq. Like every ruler of his age, he had his achievements carved: his canals, his temples, his wars, and among them, this. A caravan had crossed his territory without stopping. The inscription says who they were: people of Tamar, an oasis deep in the Arabian interior, and people of Saba, a kingdom at the far southern end of the peninsula in modern Yemen. The Hebrew Bible calls that kingdom Sheba. They had come, he complains, from a country far away. They had never sent him an envoy. They had never once travelled to meet him. Their caravan came near his wells, passed by, and went on to the town beyond. So he attacked them. Then he counted what he took: 100 people, 200 camels, and the loads those camels carried. His inscription lists them: 2 kinds of wool, one dyed blue and purple, iron, stone, and, he adds, every kind of merchandise. Nothing he names is incense. That is worth holding on to, because this road is remembered for one cargo, and it never carried only one thing. But one cargo is the reason the rest of the world knew the road was there at all: aromatic resin, frankincense and myrrh. This is the oldest surviving record we have of a caravan out of deep Arabia, almost 3,000 years old. And what it shows us, at the first moment this trade enters history, is a man with soldiers helping himself to it. Over the next 13 centuries, kingdoms would rise and fall, religions would change, the cargo itself would change completely. One thing would not. Whoever held this road took a share of what crossed it. Frankincense is tree sap. You cut the bark of a boswellia tree, wait for the resin to bleed and harden, and collect it. Burned, it gives off a clean white smoke with a scent unlike anything else in the ancient world. The tree is difficult. It grows in a narrow band of hot, dry country and almost nowhere else on Earth. The Dhofar region of southern Oman, the Hadhramaut in eastern Yemen, the island of Socotra, and the coast of the Horn of Africa opposite. Now look at where it was wanted. Egypt burned it in the temples, so did Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome. Every major religion of the ancient Mediterranean and Near East used incense in worship, in quantity, every day, for centuries. The trade moved thousands of tons of resin a year. Nobody counted it at the time, so that figure is reconstructed from Roman prices, and the best modern estimate runs to 2,500 or 3,000 tons annually, with perhaps half of it reaching Rome. Between the trees and the temples lay more than 2,000 kilometers of some of the harshest terrain on the planet. How the resin crossed that gap is the story. Who controlled the crossing? What everyone along the way charged for passage? And what became of all of it when the ancient world stopped burning incense? It begins with that robbed caravan on the Euphrates, and it runs for the next 1,300 years. The camel can go for days between wells. It feeds on scrub that would kill other animals, and it carries a load while doing it. Nothing else available in the region could cross that country under load. The one-humped camel was domesticated in southern Arabia, most likely during the 2nd millennium before Christ. The dating is put carefully, because domestication is a long process rather than an event, and it is actively argued over. Recent work on animal bones and on camel genetics has moved parts of the picture. What matters here is later and less contested. Camels were unlikely to be carrying incense north in any quantity before the 1st millennium before Christ. By the 9th century, carvings in Syria and Assyria show them loaded and ridden. From that point, the interior of Arabia stops being a barrier and becomes a route. The empires at the northern end noticed the traffic quickly. In the 730s before Christ, the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III defeated an Arab queen named Shamsi and listed what he captured: camels, cattle, and 5,000 bags of spices. 5,000 bags taken from a single defeated ruler. The trade was already large. At the southern end, the incense built states. By the classical period, there were 4 kingdoms in what is now Yemen and southern Oman: Ma'in, Saba at Marib, Qataban, and Hadhramaut at Shabwa, which held the frankincense country itself. None of them were empires. They were compact kingdoms with irrigated farmland and control of the trade in something the world wanted. And look at where their capitals sit, not in the fertile highlands. Every one of them stands on the inland edge of the settled country, on the margin of the sand desert, exactly where the caravans passed. These were not farming capitals that happened to trade. They were built on the road. Around the early 7th century before Christ, a Sabaean ruler named Karibil Wata carved 2 of the longest inscriptions ancient Arabia ever produced, in a temple at Sirwa. They record campaign after campaign against his neighbours, towns taken, colonies planted, control of the trading corridor secured, and dedicated to his god. The inscriptions treat that corridor as worth a war. We know how the system worked at ground level because a Roman wrote it down. Pliny the Elder was an imperial official and the compiler of the ancient world's great encyclopedia of natural history. He collected facts obsessively, including prices, and he had access to merchants who had made the journey. For the incense trade, he is the closest thing we have to a trade correspondent. Pliny says all frankincense had to be brought to Shabwa, and that it entered the city through one single gate. There, the priests took 1/10 of it for their god before any of it could be sold. From Shabwa, it could leave only through the territory of Qataban, whose king charged his own fee. Then 65 stages by camel to Gaza on the Mediterranean coast. Nobody mapped it at the time. What the sources fix are the stations, not the road between them, so the line drawn here is a reconstruction. At every stage, someone was owed something: water, fodder, lodging, passage. Pliny adds it all up. 688 denarii for every single camel spent before the cargo ever reached the sea. To see what that meant, set it against what the camel was carrying. A full load sold at the Mediterranean end for something in the region of 1,300 denarii. So more than half the value of the cargo had already been paid out on the journey. The resin was the least of the cost. Getting it there was almost all of it. At the Roman frontier, there was one more charge. Rome taxed goods arriving from the Indian Ocean at 1/4 of their value, a rate it applied nowhere else in its empire. Frankincense, in the end, escaped it. A Roman tariff schedule lists frankincense, alongside black pepper, as a necessity rather than a luxury. So the one aromatic Rome's temples could not do without entered the empire duty-free. Myrrh paid the full quota. 7 centuries earlier, the governor of Suhu had taken his share with soldiers. By Pliny's day, the road charged in advance. One more thing held it together, and no king provided it. Arabian tradition remembers certain months of the year as sacred, months in which fighting was forbidden. The great fairs were held in those months. The caravans moved in them. Along much of this route, the thing that made trade possible was not an army. It was a truce that everyone agreed to keep. The desert road had one weakness. It ended at a coastline, and the coastline had ships. For centuries, those ships stayed close to shore, moving cargo from harbour to harbour in short hops. Then sailors working the Indian Ocean learned to use something the desert could never offer: Twice a year, the winds over the northern Indian Ocean reverse. Southwest all summer, northeast all winter. Learn the timing, and you can sail out with one wind and home with the other. That knowledge came slowly. It begins a little before 100 before Christ, and the first step is modest, simply coasting at the right season instead of the wrong one. By the reign of Tiberius, ships were running past Aden and Kana to Ras Fatak, then striking out across open water to the mouth of the Indus. A few decades later, under Claudius, captains were making the long direct crossing to the pepper coast of southern India. 50 years of seamanship, learned one leg at a time. In 30 before Christ, Rome annexed Egypt and inherited two Red Sea ports, Myos Hormos and Berenike, both on Egypt's eastern desert coast. The Greek geographer Strabo, writing soon after and drawing on what he saw in Egypt, reports about 120 ships sailing for India in a single season. Under the previous rulers, he says, hardly any had gone at all. We even have the Trade's Handbook. In the middle of the 1st century after Christ, a working merchant based in Roman Egypt wrote a guide to the whole run. Every port in order, who ruled it, what to buy, what to bring, what not to do. His name is lost. The book survives. It is called the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, and for this stretch of the story, it is our eyewitness. What it describes is not free trade. It is a set of royal monopolies. At Musa, near the mouth of the Red Sea, the port answers to an official appointed by the king, and the myrrh export passes through royal hands. In Hadhramaut, the entire frankincense harvest of the kingdom must be delivered to one single harbour, called Kana, on the coast of modern Yemen. A later inscription calls that port the king's storehouse. And at the eastern edge of the growing country, the kings of Hadhramaut built a harbour of their own. We know it today as Khor Rori in Oman. Its founding inscriptions record it as a colony planted deliberately from the capital to collect the harvest at the source. The Periplus records something remarkable about it. Frankincense lay stacked there in the open, unguarded. Not because nobody would steal it, but because the place was under the protection of a god, and no ship could load without the king's permission. The handbook notes, without comment, that a ship loading without leave would not reach home. The same system as the single gate at Shabwa moved to the water. One site shows how far that system reached, better than any document. Socotra is an island in the Arabian Sea, more than 200 kilometers off the Horn of Africa. It produced aloes and a red resin the ancients called dragon's blood, and by this period its trade was controlled from Hadhramaut, with fixed prices and tariffs. The Periplus describes its goods leaving on small boats and rafts held up with inflated animal skins, bound for Kana. In the year 2000, a Belgian caving team surveying a cave called Hock, which runs 2 kilometers into the island's northern cliffs, found writing on the walls deep inside. Not one script, 5. South Arabian, from the incense kingdoms, Brahmi from India, Ge'ez from Ethiopia, Greek, and a wooden tablet carrying a prayer in the Aramaic of Palmyra, the great caravan city of the Syrian desert, dated by its own text to the year 257. Roughly 250 inscriptions in total. Sailors and merchants from 3 continents walking 2 kilometers into the dark of an island at the edge of the known world to leave their names in the same cave. The Egyptian end confirms the scale. Excavation at Berenike has turned up documents in 12 different languages and a single jar holding 7.5 kilograms of Indian black pepper. Out in the Red Sea, on the Khorasan Islands, Latin inscriptions record a detachment of the Roman army stationed roughly 1,000 kilometers beyond the empire's nearest border, watching the sea lane. By the 2nd century after Christ, the incense kingdoms were richer than they had ever been. They owned the trees, the collection points, and the harbours. They did not own the demand, and they no longer owned the route. In the 3rd century, the record goes quiet. Greek and Roman writers had been describing these harbours for 200 years. They stop. And when South Arabian inscriptions mention the ports in this century, they are almost always describing a war. One inscription of the period, known as IR13, records a Sabaean force marching into Hadhramaut. It states that they took plunder from the capital and from Kana, that they entered the harbour, and that they burned the ships lying at anchor there. The port that had supplied the temples of Rome for 200 years was set alight by a neighbouring army. It did not stop there. Axumite troops from the kingdom across the Red Sea in the Horn of Africa crossed and held the Tihama, the coastal plain of Western Arabia, for most of the century. And at the century's end, the four-kingdom system itself ended. Saba's dynasty faded, and by the year 299, a Himyarite king, Shema-Uharish, held a title claiming all of South Arabia. Saba, Duraden, Hadhramaut, and the coastal lowlands under one crown. And at the far end of the road, the customer was collapsing. 3rd century Rome went through plague, civil war, and a currency that lost most of its value. Palmyra, the caravan city that organized the desert trade, rebelled and was destroyed by Roman armies in the 270s. On the Egyptian coast, Myos Hormos was abandoned. Berenica shrank. Producers, shippers, middlemen, and market. Every link in a chain that had held for 1,000 years failed inside a single century. For a long time, this is where the story of the incense trade ended. Then archaeologists dug the ports and found a problem. The sites had not died. At Kana, the harbour whose ships were burned, the levels above the destruction show the port still working. Smaller and facing a different direction. Wine jars arriving from the northern Red Sea. Pottery from Ethiopia, in quantities suggesting Ethiopian traders living there. A building the excavators identify as a synagogue, on its architecture and on a Greek graffito found with it. Its customers were no longer in the Mediterranean. They were in India and in Ethiopia. Second, the centre of the trade moved north. The jars tell you where. Amphorae fired in the kilns at Aqaba turn up at Kana and on the African shore at Adulis and along the ports at the head of the Red Sea. One shipping system in the same pottery running between Axumite Adulis, the northern ports, and a reduced Kana. Not everything shrank. Aden flourished in these centuries while its neighbours were cut back to anchorages. And we can count the ships. In the year 525, the king of Axum gathered a fleet to invade Yemen. An account of that campaign lists where the vessels came from. 15 from Aqaba, 20 from Suez, 7 from an island in the Red Sea, 2 from Berenica, 7 from the Farasan Islands, 9 that had just returned from India, and 10 built on the African coast at Adulis. 70 ships assembled at short notice, most of them taken off ordinary trading runs. That account comes down to us in a saint's life, written to honour a Christian king, so the number is best treated as a scale rather than an audit. Even allowing for that, the shipping was still there to be gathered. Third, and this is the part most easily missed, the demand itself changed shape. Rome had burned incense institutionally, by the ton, at public altars. Christian worship used it too, but by the handful, in a censer. Rome, after its crisis, had less to spend, and Byzantium began buying its silk through Axumite middlemen rather than South Arabian ones, taking a whole line of business out of Arabian hands. And in exactly the same period, Arabia changed as well. From the 4th century, references to the old gods vanish almost entirely from the inscriptions of Yemen, replaced by a single god called the Merciful, the Lord of Heaven. Within 2 centuries, the peninsula's religious landscape was largely monotheist. The incense trade did not lose its market. The market changed religion at both ends of the road at roughly the same time. Fourth, the caravans kept moving and changed what they carried. The northbound trade of the 5th and 6th centuries is dominated by the products of herding people: leather, hides, wool, livestock, humbler goods than frankincense. Then look at who was buying. Rome and Persia spent this period locked in the longest and most exhausting wars in their history, and pre-modern armies ran on leather. Tents, boots, harness, water carriers, shields. On one modern estimate, a single legion needed the hides of some 65,000 goats for its tents alone. Arabia had sold the ancient world its luxuries. It now sold the late antique world its equipment. Later tradition connects the merchants of Mecca with this traffic, and historians still debate how far that trade reached and what exactly it carried. The wider pattern is not in doubt. Caravans were moving north again, in volume, through a peninsula that now prayed to one god. Whether inland Arabia was still wealthy in this period is answered by one monument. The Great Dam at Marib had stood for over 1,000 years, turning seasonal floodwater into farmland. In the year 455, it broke to its foundations. The inscription recording the repair is not a victory monument. It is a supply ledger. The king summoned 20,000 men from across Himyar and Hadhramaut, and the stone counts what it took to feed them. 285,000 measures of flour, wheat, barley, corn, and dates. 1,363 animals slaughtered, camels, sheep, and cattle. 1,000 pairs of oxen, 670 camels carrying drink, 42 loads of honey and butter. A government feeding 20,000 men in a desert and accounting for every measure of it in stone. 90 years later, the dam broke again and was repaired again by Abraha, the worker then governing Yemen. His inscription lists who attended the works: envoys of the Roman emperor, of the king of Persia, of the king of Axum, and of the Arab kings allied to each empire. In the middle of the 6th century, every major power in the region kept a representative at a court in the Yemeni desert. The frankincense ports were cold. The voting came anyway. By the year 600, the picture had settled into something new. The kingdoms that had run the trade were finished. The last dated inscription in the old South Arabian script belongs to the year 559. Within a generation, Persia had taken Yemen outright, landing a force under a commander named Wariz, and ruled it directly from then on. 1,000 years of kings recording their harvests, their dams, and their wars in stone comes to a stop. The southern harbours were reduced. Aden still worked, though Persian officials now collected the tide there. Most of the others had shrunk or emptied, and the long-distance sea trade of the Red Sea was largely in Ethiopian, Roman, and Persian hands. And as the coast emptied, the interior filled. The overland routes were carrying more again, and carrying different goods, north from the pastoral interior toward 2 empires at war. The organising of that traffic had passed inland to the oasis towns of the west and centre of the peninsula. Places with no harbour, no dam, and no monumental inscriptions, run by merchant families rather than kings. They worked to a calendar. Arabian tradition remembers the year as a circuit of fairs, each in its own month, each under someone's protection. Dumat al-Jandal in the north, Suhar and Daba on the eastern coast, Aden and Sana'a in the south, Ukaz in the west, where disputes were settled, blood debts paid, and poets competed. In the sacred months, fighting was forbidden, and the caravans moved. At Ukaz, the envoys of the Arab king of Hira, the client of Persia, came to buy Yemeni leather. 13 centuries after a governor on the Euphrates robbed a caravan from a country far away, the road was still there. The kingdoms that built it were gone. The temples that consumed its cargo had closed. The cargo itself had changed completely. None of that was ever the costly part. Frankincense could be bought by the pound in Rome. Crossing Arabia could not be bought at all. What the ancient world paid for in the end was the crossing, and the crossing outlasted everyone who ever charged for it.